Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of The Huntsman Winter's War, which is a sequel to Snow White and the Huntsman, which came out a few years prior. So, I'm actually surprised they went ahead and made this sequel because there was a lot working against it behind the scenes. There was a significant amount of controversy surrounding its star, Kristen Stewart, having an affair with her married director while she herself was in a relationship with Robert Pattinson. And this being back when Twilight was still relevant, this pissed a lot of people off. So both of them were fired, and that means that Snow White would not be appearing in the Snow White sequel. And yes, it was a financial hit. However, it wasn't necessarily a box office breaking success, such as, let's say, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, which I actually consider to be a much inferior movie, but it grossed like $1 billion, so of course they're going to make a sequel to that. In fact, I'm surprised it's taken so long for a sequel to Alice in Wonderland to finally come out. And for the most part, the reception was very lukewarm. Most people who saw Snow White and the Huntsman thought it was okay and nothing more. And I am one of those people. I was pleasantly surprised just because I wasn't entirely sure if it was going to be like a Twilight knockoff, but instead it ended up being more of a Lord of the Rings styled actioner, even though it's definitely a poor man's version. There was certainly some entertainment value. However, I can remember very little of what actually occurred within the movie, and it seems like general audiences agreed with me, where we all went to the theaters, we watched it, we tolerated it, maybe even enjoyed it. However, we did not take any of it home with us, other than maybe the scandal which surrounded it. It's as if the film just dissipated from our collective memories, so nobody was really clamoring for a sequel, which is the main reason I'm surprised they went ahead and made it. In fact, Snow White and the Huntsman was so forgettable that even the filmmakers behind the sequel seem to have forgotten what actually occurred within that film. Which makes me laugh, but it also just sort of confuses me too. When it comes down to it, Snow White and the Huntsman, whether you liked it or not, just did not have enough of an impact to stir up interest for a sequel. And yet the studio made one anyway. Yet there is one thing that actually caught our attention, and that is its cast. Of course, you had Chris Hemsworth returning, even though I'd argue that he's not much of a star, as most of his movies away from the Marvel Cinematic Universe have been failing. But you have Charlize Theron, Emily Blunt, Jessica Chastain. They're among, three of the hottest actresses in Hollywood right now. And the fact that they all signed on to this movie could imply that it had a really good script, or at the absolute least, the studio was aware of its disadvantages going in, and so wanted to make this film as compelling as possible, if only for its cast. But the film came out, it was panned by critics, and it seems to be a flop. Is The Huntsman Winter's War as bad as everybody says it is? Yeah, kinda. While I was watching it, I could not really decide whether it was bad or just mediocre, but the more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion that, yeah, The Huntsman kind of sucks. Simply because it is boring. But The Huntsman is bad, but unlike, let's say, Fantastic Four, its badness doesn't really jump out at you. Instead, it just stealthily ruins the movie without you ever knowing what is making it boring or why none of it is working. So I made sure to write down my notes, but what's funny is most of these sound small. These complaints might even sound like nitpicks to you. However, what they ultimately do is they have they're small ripples that create devastating waves on the rest of the narrative. The first mistake that The Huntsman makes is it alienates and confuses those who watched the first film. There are quite a few very noticeable retcons, and they render a lot of the payoffs to the first movie mute, pointless. And the connections between the Huntsman and Snow White and the Huntsman are so tenuous that you kind of feel like this may have at one point been an original project that was converted into a sequel at the very last moment. In a lot of ways, I was reminded of a movie called Tekken 2 Kazuya's Revenge, which is a direct-to-DVD sequel to the live-action 2010 Tekken movie, which sucked. But it's one of the things that made Tekken 2 even worse is that you could tell that it had no real relationship with the first film. So it led to a lot of inconsistencies and plot holes and retcons, and that kind of stuff always disorients the audience. So, for example, Charlize Theron's character is talking to her sister, played by Emily Blunt. Now, if you remember, Theron's character was the antagonist of Snow White and the Huntsman, but she had a brother, and this movie pretty much just removes him from existence. There's no reference to him whatsoever, even though he played a major part in the Huntsman's backstory. Now, if you remember anything about that movie, and I had to look it up just to clarify, because once again, my memory of the first film is very hazy, the brother actually was the one who killed Chris Hemsworth's wife, and his whole motivation was trying to get her resurrected. And yet the brother is never mentioned, never referenced, and his wife is in this movie played by Jessica Chastain, and she suffers a much different fate. Am I the only one remembering this? They have that big scene where the brother is taunting Chris Hemsworth about what he did to his wife, and Chris Hemsworth reacts with rage, so he obviously believes this guy, and yet Chris Hemsworth apparently witnessed her murder at the hands of somebody else. That's very confusing. And what is arguably worse, though, is it tries to tie in Snow White's story into this one, but it doesn't really give us any kind of payoff. It's established early on that the mirror is making Snow White go crazy. In fact, this is another thing that's going to throw you off too. She apparently married that prince whom she rejected in favor of Chris Hemsworth in the first film, once again rendering that pointless. And he's the one who's the prince is explaining. I guess he's the king now. He's explaining that Snow White has gone crazy, and we see a body double of her because Kristen Stewart obviously was not going to reprise this role. And there's never any real indication that madness goes away. I mean, you presume so, but they should have at least said something about Snow White got better after this, because the plot is jump started by her going crazy apparently, and that's the main reason why the Huntsman goes on this quest. And he also tells the prince that Emily Blunt's character is going to invade their lands probably, so get your army ready, and send them to the border or whatever. So you think that that's going to lead to some sort of big battle between these armies, but no, his army is never brought up again. That character is never brought up again, and it just seems like they just really wanted to force the connection to Snow White and the Huntsman. And here is how a ripple becomes a wave. One of the most basic rules of narrative structure is if you open a story thread, you have to be sure to close it, to give it some form of resolution, an emotional payoff, to make that scene worth it. Otherwise, we're just going to see it as filler, which means that it's only designed to pad out the running time, which means that you're going to be a little bit more bored because that was so unnecessary. And the film is constantly doing shit like that. When you look at the overarching narrative, it starts off where the queen wants to invade Snow White's lands, but apparently needs the mirror to do so. I didn't understand why. And I wasn't entirely sure who stole the mirror in the first place. That was very confusing, very sloppily written. But so Chris Hemsworth, he has to get the mirror before she does. But there's also a much more personal reason, is that the Ice Queen, Emily Blunt, she is responsible for the death of his wife. So naturally, he's going to want vengeance, and we can make an emotional connection to that. However, we find out very shortly afterwards that his wife is actually alive and well, and they're working together to get this mirror. So immediately that dramatic tension is lessened because now his motivations are not going to have as much fire. Now you could argue that, well, they're trying to get the mirror so the queen doesn't invade the lands, which of course means that there are some pretty high stakes. However, the queen's presence is never really felt throughout this journey. Most of the obstacles are just individual obstacles like goblins or some dwarves. They don't have any alignment with the queen whatsoever. So if they had maybe scenes of the queen's army gearing up for war, or the queen sending more agents out to retrieve this mirror, I would have felt something. But instead, there's just no reason to get invested in this overarching narrative. Now, yes, there is the big revelation that the wife was actually on the queen's side all along, and that's supposed to be this big surprise. But the only way I would have really felt any kind of tension there is if maybe characters were kind of suggesting the possibility, because where they're going as soon as she says, "I escaped from the dungeon somehow." But that's just bad writing, because it was supposed to be this big twist, and the fact that you could see through that twist doesn't make it more compelling. It just makes it more annoying. But then immediately afterwards, you do quickly figure out that, yeah, she still does love Chris Hemsworth, so you know where the story is going, and it's just hard to care for that reason. Another example is Charlize Theron's character gets resurrected near the end of the movie, and she immediately says, well, I want to get vengeance on Snow White, and her goal only seems to be able to be, I want to kill Snow White and take my lands back. She never mentions the Huntsman up until he shows up to attack, and even then she's like, oh, you're here, cool, I can kill you now. But it doesn't really seem like she's all that interested in him, and he in turn does not seem that interested in her. He barely reacts to her resurrection, and yet the final conflict is between those two. So because the characters don't seem to care that much, it's hard to care for what's going on between them. And you don't really care that the queen poses a threat to Snow White, because Snow White barely registers in this movie. And that kind of stuff just really makes you less interested in what is happening, and that's just the biggest problem with the narrative and why it is a very boring movie. Also, the Ice Queen is neither sympathetic or detestable. She has a very tragic backstory, but so did Charlize Theron's character, that makes you kind of pity her. However, Charlize Theron probably had a hand in her baby's death, and therefore it makes it difficult for you to really hate her. But at the same time, you can't really feel bad for her, because she starts doing such horrendous stuff that you're just not entirely sure what to feel about her. And when the film tries asking you to feel a certain way, you just can never really go with it, because you feel like you've been pulled in too many different directions with this character, and that once again lessens the dramatic tension and makes it difficult to feel anything regarding this character. Other things to talk about: the CGI is fine, but the color scheme of the film is very dreary, so I didn't like the visual style. I found it to be very unappealing, and total contrast to the first film, which at least had very vibrant, colorful landscapes. The action scenes were technically well choreographed, but the director just doesn't know how to engage his audience. So I even found the battles to be rather unexciting, even though there's nothing about them, from the visual effects to the editing to the camera work, that I would say was objectively horrible. So that's just really all I have to say. The narrative, there's too many blunders within the narrative that really diminish the emotional impact, making it boring, and everything else from the visual effects just could not overcome those shortcomings to make it exciting or entertaining at all. The Huntsman is just a boring ass movie, and you should probably avoid it. Even if you liked the first film, wait till it comes out on Netflix or Hulu or something like that. I don't think it's worth seeing in the theaters. You're just going to be annoyed and disappointed.